Dark romance books have become the topic of a lot of debate recently, and there's a lot of controversy around them, especially with the movie adaptation of Hunting Adeline coming out. And I decided that I would give dark romance a go because I've never read it before in my life, and I wanted to give myself a bit of experience and see what I thought about the dark romance genre. Now, I'm not going to lie, I thought that Hunting Adeline would be a bit of a tough starting point for me because I have never read any before. So I decided to start with God of Malice, thinking that it was going to be a little bit less impactful, but I'm not entirely sure that it was. Like, I was actually reading this as an audiobook, so I was listening to it rather than reading it. I was walking around Montenegro and I was constantly checking to make sure that this was not coming out of my phone speaker, because my god, there was some scenes in this I definitely did not want people hearing that I was listening to. Now, let's get into my thoughts, and this is going to be a riff of exactly what I was thinking at the time. There's no notes, there's nothing, so this is a raw interaction. At first, I was actually close to DNFing this book. The first, I don't know how many pages, but the first sort of chapter or two that I was listening to, the essay essentially that was going on, it made me uncomfortable. I'm not gonna lie, it did make me a little uncomfortable. Now, this wasn't a trigger warning kind of thing. I just didn't understand the appeal of the character at all. I can read these types of things. I just didn't understand where the appeal was coming from. The man was literally on the edge of a cliff with her. She was looking, he held her from there and then forced her into something that she didn't seem that comfortable with. I just couldn't understand the appeal of it. And to be honest, I still don't really understand the appeal of the initial character, okay? Now, I will get into some of the maybe not redeeming qualities, but I will understand the appeal later on. But I did struggle with the first sort of chapter or two, and I'm not gonna lie, I was close to DNFing, but I'm glad that I did read all of it. Well, listen to all of it. First, I'm actually gonna go into the positives of this, okay? Some of the scenes, especially in a roleplay format, fully consenting, fully trust, exactly communicating the whole way through in a roleplay format, I can understand, because damn, and like some of that I would, and even going the other way in terms of, yeah, okay, some of them were still a wee bit but again, in a sort of roleplay sense, I kind of understand where it's coming from, and I can understand the fantasy and the appeal of it. I do get that. Secondly, and maybe more importantly than the first, and actually probably definitely more important than the first, was I can understand the sort of possessiveness and the obsession and the appeal of that. I can understand why that is appealing, because that man only had eyes for Glyndon. Killian only had eyes for Glyndon. Absolutely, he only did after that attack. In the way that he did, I think it was a little bit too strong, but I understand that this is the appeal of dark romance, and I get it. It's like a fantasy. It wouldn't necessarily work realistically, but it works in fantasy. I get that. And I do understand, because there were some of those sort of things where he was talking about like what he would do if anyone else put his hands on her, how he was only thinking about her, and even the scene they having the water sprayed on him, and like whenever he was there, and the first thing he thought of was Glyndon, and the fact that he was willing to go and take her to see his parents, even though he wasn't sure that he would ever be willing to give a heart to anyone, and he was able to do that with her. I get that, okay? That I absolutely get. I think I can understand the appeal of that. Another thing that I actually found really interesting in this story was the whole understory of like, mafia, those sort of elitist groups. I found that really interesting, but I thought that the actual storylines of those were so interesting, and I will continue to read the series because I'm so interested in all of that. And I think there's some of the other characters I'm actually really interested in learning about, like Jeremy. Seems really interesting. I'm really interested to learn about Jeremy. Nikolai a bit as well, actually. I'm interested in Nikolai, but Jeremy especially, as that kind of leader, sort of seems a little level-headed, but, well, none of them are level-headed, but do you know what I mean? He's like more calculated. Calculated is the word that I'm looking for. I'm looking forward to seeing more about that. But, like, for example, the hunt and the initiation, I thought that was such an interesting concept. Entirely gruesome, over the top, and I get that, but from a fictional standpoint, I find that fascinating. I thought that was such an interesting concept to have, as like, this is how they get into it, and it explores like why Killian wanted to do what he did and why Nikolai wanted to do what he did a little bit. Obviously, you don't get as much touch on that because it's not his book and it's Killian's book, but I did find that so interesting to explore, like, okay, this is why he does what he does. And then the fact that he then found Glyndon and he sort of took it easier on her and those sorts of things, and he waited and he was patient with her. That whole scene of like, this is the initiation, like I'm imagining that in my head, is such an interesting concept. I think that's fascinating. Like, I was just looking, I was hooked at that point. I was like, okay, I want to know exactly what's happening with this whole organization, everything. I also quite liked exploring a lot of the family dynamics that were going on. Like, there was a lot of intense family dynamics that do happen in the world. Now, obviously, these are like elite mafia bosses and these sorts of things. Not necessarily the same way it happens in the real world. But the stuff with his older brother Gareth and Killian, and the sort of jealousy maybe that Killian has, but like he's trying to pass it off that he's not jealous. I kind of thought that was quite interesting. I liked seeing the relationship with Glyndon and her grandparents, and how much there was care going back and forth, and how protective the granddad was as well, especially in the later part of the series. I also really liked the stuff with her brothers. Now, I liked exploring the dynamic of it. So with Bran being slightly softer brother, I liked that whenever he was there with her and just stayed with her whenever she was doing the painting immediately after it happened with Killian. I liked that he was there to support her. I liked the sort of more soft side of Bran going through it. I also quite liked exploring Landon's character. I think I can see where Landon was coming from in a lot of it in terms of the protective older brother, and especially knowing where Killian's come from. I do understand in terms of why that type of character would do what he did to protect Glyndon. But again, it is also Glyndon's life. She can choose to do what she wants to do. And at that point, he didn't know about exactly what Killian had done in the first part. So I do kind of understand that. And the fact that then Glyndon kind of overcame that. But again, is that maybe Stockholm Syndrome? Is that maybe what's kind of going on? I don't know. I kind of like the fact that they explored that sort of protective older brother. Because in the same sense, essentially, he was doing what Killian was doing, but just from a brotherly perspective and not in the love of a brother, not in the love of a lover. Because he just wanted to protect her and he would kill anyone who put their hands on him. I kind of get that. Again, also seeing like what the dad and stuff does. I did quite like that. I found it really interesting, the whole dynamics. And this one, like, it was such a confusing book originally at the start for me, but I did like it. I definitely did like it at the end, and I definitely want to read more of them. But it was not what I was expecting, and especially for me, this is like my first one. It kind of was a bit of a shock whenever it first of all went in, and there is definitely some negatives that I'm going to get into. But yeah, I found all that really interesting. Now, into the negatives. First negative is obviously the start of the book. That really, in terms of realistic, I understand there's the whole fantasy of dark romance, but that start of the thing, whenever you see that sort of happen with other people and like how that can affect certain people, and I understand that this book does have trigger warnings, and I think it's entirely right to have trigger warnings because exactly that did make me a little bit uncomfortable reading about that, because I just can't imagine anyone thinking about that way and the way that he did it and just doing it without her agreeing. That didn't sit right with me. I understand the appeal of it as it kind of got through, and I do think Killian definitely redeemed himself. Not redeemed, I don't even think he redeemed himself, to be honest, but I understand why he was liked by the end of it, and I understand the appeal of Killian by the end of it, if that makes sense, because I found myself quite liking Killian by the end of it, which it sounds horrendous because I don't like him because of what he was doing at the start. I'm going to get into another part that I don't like about him. But I kind of liked the relationship that he had in terms of that he actually cared for Glyndon and made sure that Glyndon was there. But was he manipulative? Was he controlling? In this sort of side of things, in a fantasy and in terms of a role play, I think these books worked fantastically. Obviously, realistically, this is a remarkably toxic relationship, which should not be in real life. However, in terms of a fantasy, in terms of being able to explore that fantasy, I think that's absolutely, if that's your fantasy and that's the way that you want to enjoy things, 100%. But these books need to be taken with nuance. They 100% do. In real life, that relationship is not only toxic, it's way past that. Real life, obviously it doesn't matter, but these are fiction for a reason. They're a fantasy for people. People should be able to enjoy that fantasy to an extent, obviously, with that fantasy. And I think that that's kind of why I understand where it's coming from, but there is a lot of it that it did make me uncomfortable, and it did unsettle me a little bit at the start. The other thing that I think I find in the book that I will never be able to like Killian, because in terms of if I was a real person, it would be impossible to like him, was the stuff when I was talking about with his thoughts and his ideations, and the stuff that he did with like the rats, I think it was, and things like that, to be able to see the insides, and that was why I was going into medicine, and that sort of helped maybe numb the thoughts. Obviously that is psychotic. That's just no. But I get that that's kind of the point, to make the character more interesting, and it's making it a more interesting character. I get that. That's why I'm like, okay, I understand that. But for me, obviously that character is never going to click. There is, again, some elements of the character that I do like, but the character as a whole, I don't like because of those sorts of things. I like the sort of not possessive side. I don't like that even, but I like the sort of obsessive sort of, like, on how much he likes, but again, it's obviously taken to the extreme, but that's literally what dark romance is about. I get that it's kind of hard to put into words, but I do like that. Like, there is things about him that I like, and how much he cares for Glyndon at certain points, but again, whenever you're starting a relationship off like that, that's just what I enjoyed the book, and I will definitely read more. But again, there was definitely bits that made me a little bit uncomfortable, that I wasn't as happy with, that I didn't particularly like. But I do, as a whole, think I will read more dark romance. I just think that, again, especially with stuff, some of it just needs to be taken with nuance. But again, it's a fantasy. It's not necessarily to be taken as like this is gospel. Reading needs to be taken with nuance. Like anything, everything needs to be taken with nuance and applied nuance to it. Because if you don't apply nuance to things like this, that's where things get out of control. And that's where people can be like, oh, people will take this and excuse other behaviors in real life for it. And if it gets to that point, people are excusing behaviors in real life, that's the point where it's no, that's a no-go for me. Reading this and being able to separate it as just a fantasy, fine, I get that. If you're including this and you're sort of thinking that it's encouraging certain behaviors and you're not reading it with nuance and you're really sort of proactively trying to find some of these things and not necessarily in a roleplay sort of environment or whatever, again, entirely understand that. That's where I think that you kind of need to draw the line. I think it's a tough line to navigate, and that's why I understand why there is a lot of backlash with Hunting Adeline. I do understand that entirely, because again, I haven't read the book. From what I've understood though, it's like pure stalking and all this sort of thing, and probably worse than what's going on in this book. And the fact that that could maybe encourage people, I understand why people don't like that. But people who are able to read it with the nuance that's implied and are able to just treat it as just a fantasy. And even if you just like reading the book because it's interesting, and I think that's what for me it was. Like, this is obviously not a fantasy for me. It's far from it. I think a lot of stuff in that wasn't there, but I found the book interesting to read. The whole underlying story of it, trying to understand the appeal of certain characters, and to an extent, like, understanding some of the appeal. Like I said, some of the scenes, when especially later in the books when they're in the relationship, I get that. Like, I think that as a fantasy, like I said, in a roleplay environment, pretty damn good. But there's a lot of the scenes as well, especially early on in the book, that really did make me uncomfortable and a little bit. So yeah, I think read with nuance. That's really the point that I'm trying to make here. So how would I rate the book overall? For me, I would say the book was about 3.5 stars out of 5. I liked certain elements of it. I think the start, like I said, I found very uncomfortable, but I understand that that's kind of the point of these types of books. But as the book went on, I did understand a lot of the appeal. Would I ever recommend Killian as an actual book boyfriend? No. Because, my God, that's psychotic. However, like I said, the appeal, and in terms of weirdly, in terms of a book boyfriend, I understand. It is in terms of a real boyfriend, absolutely the fuck not. So that's kind of where I would draw the line. Do I think that people shouldn't be able to read these books? Absolutely not. People should be able to read essentially whatever they want, within reason. And these books draw on a fantasy in certain ways, and they also create a curiosity, like find a book that I find interesting. I think reading is an art, and people can choose to read whatever they want, again, entirely within reason. But it's where do you draw that line? And I think that's the tough part with these books, because for me, some of this was towing the line very, very close, and some of it I would arguably say was a little bit over for me personally. But that didn't make me uncomfortable. I think for me personally, I just didn't like certain elements of it, but I was able to like a lot of the other elements as well and understand why certain elements went the way that they did. But again, in real life, no, that type of relationship, entirely psychotic. In a fantasy, yeah. So I think overall, Glyndon, I like Glyndon as a character. I think she's strong, she's independent, especially the way she stands up to her brothers. And to be fair, she also stands up to Killian multiple times and puts him in his place. I really like that. Killian, I don't really like as a character, but I understand the appeal of what he's doing in terms of, like I said, the possessiveness and the obsessiveness, and why that's appealing in certain ways, and how much he, like, that this girl is his one and only. I get that. Like, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I do get sort of the kicking the feet of that. But yeah, I think overall, I like dark romance, but it wouldn't necessarily, it's my favourite genre. I'll definitely read more, but I wouldn't say that it's my favourite genre. And I think dark romance in particular, out of all of these books, is something that really needs to be read with nuance. And obviously, with a mature head on your shoulders, you need to be a mature reader to be able to read these types of books and not be affected by the content in them, but also understand the difference in what this content means in terms of in practice and in just, oh, it's a written book, it's fine, you can separate this. It's a wee bit like sort of, I know it's not the exact same, but like video games, like people talk about like GTA and things like that. There's a lot of things in GTA that I disagree with. Can it be played with nuance? Yes, it absolutely can. But there's things in GTA that people do. People in Call of Duty, like, does Call of Duty encourage violence because you're playing a video game? No. Does reading this book encourage any of the behavior in this book? No. It's a bit of fun. It's something that, like, entertainment. It's entertainment. That's the thing. It's not always just necessarily that it's a fantasy. It's an entertainment thing. If it's entertaining to you and it's not harming anyone by reading the book, do whatever you want, but if it harms anyone, and again, there is certain content that I think obviously goes way past the mark, and I think for me some of this does toe the edge, but again, I do think it's such an interesting book series to actually read about.